There is a category of crime that tribunals have struggled to name correctly, not because it is ambiguous, but because it is structurally different from anything the law had been developed to process. It is not the crime of impulse, not the crime of rage, of greed, of desperation. It is the crime of routine. The crime that happens between breakfast and lunch, between one meeting and the next, between a purchase order and a delivery confirmation. The crime that requires no one to hate anyone, that requires no one to pull a trigger, that requires, in fact, nothing more from anyone than continuing to do what they have always done. In 1942, a German company received a supply order from one of its regular clients. The order was for a product the company had been manufacturing for 20 years, one it sold legally across Europe, that had been approved by health authorities in multiple countries, and that the United States Navy used routinely in its ports for pest control. The order specified one modification. The client wanted the version without the safety additive, the chemical component that, in the standard formulation, emitted a warning odor to alert anyone entering a treated, enclosed space that the product was still active. The company processed the order, made the delivery, issued the invoice, recorded the payment. The product was Zyklon B. The client was the administrative office of the Auschwitz concentration camp, and the removal of the warning system had exactly one possible implication: that the people inside the enclosed space were not meant to be warned. There is no alternative interpretation. And that is precisely why the central question of this video is not what Zyklon B did. It is what normalcy permitted. To understand Zyklon B, you first need to understand hydrogen cyanide, and to understand hydrogen cyanide, you need to understand what happens when the most fundamental process of cellular biology is interrupted in an irreversible way. Every living cell requires energy. In animal cells, that energy is produced in the mitochondria through a process biochemists call oxidative phosphorylation, the controlled transfer of electrons along a chain of proteins that culminates in the use of oxygen to produce adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, the universal energy currency of biology. The final step of that process is catalyzed by an enzyme called cytochrome C oxidase. The hydrogen cyanide molecule, HCN, has an extraordinarily high chemical affinity for the iron atom at the active center of that enzyme. It binds to it and does not release. With cytochrome C oxidase blocked, the electron transfer chain stops. ATP production ceases. The cell, literally, can no longer use the oxygen it is receiving. The resulting physiological paradox is what makes hydrogen cyanide particularly devastating. The lungs continue delivering oxygen to the blood. The heart continues circulating that oxygenated blood to the tissues. Oxygen is present at normal concentrations, but no cell can process it. The organism starves for energy in an environment where the fuel is available, but the capacity to metabolize it has been destroyed. The tissues with the highest metabolic demand, the cardiac muscle and the cerebral cortex, fail first. At sufficiently high concentrations, loss of consciousness occurs in under 30 seconds. Death, in intervals ranging from 2 to 15 minutes depending on concentration and body weight. Carl Wilhelm Scheele, the Swedish chemist who first isolated hydrogen cyanide in 1782, died in his laboratory in 1786, likely from accumulated poisoning through exposure to various substances throughout his career, possibly including the very compound he had discovered. Scheele had also discovered chlorine, manganese, barium, and molybdenum. He was one of the most productive chemists of his generation. He died at 43. There is something in Scheele's trajectory that resonates. Across time, the substance he identified and described with scientific precision would be transformed, a century and a half later, into an instrument of mass extermination. Science discovers. Systems decide what to do with the discovery. the technical solution that transformed hydrogen. Cyanide into a commercially viable product was developed by chemists at the company. Die Deutsche Gesellschaft für Schadlings BEMF, the German company for pest control. In the early 1920s, the compound was impregnated into pellets of diatomaceous earth, a natural sediment formed from fossilized microalgae, chemically inert and mechanically stable, which absorbed the liquid and released it gradually when exposed to air. The result was a product that was safe for storage and transport. Activated simply by opening the container in an enclosed space, Zyklon B was launched commercially in 1922. It was sold in hermetically sealed metal canisters. It had a user manual. It had a safety data sheet. And it had, in its standard formulation, a warning additive, a substance with a strong, irritating odor, included specifically because hydrogen cyanide in its pure state is colorless and nearly odorless at low concentrations, making the absence of sensory warning dangerous to the applicator. That additive was the first thing Auschwitz requested be removed. Die was not an independent company. It was a node in a corporate network whose scale and power is difficult to visualize. Without context, and whose role in the history of Zyklon B is? Precisely the kind of thing that complex corporate structures are efficient at obscuring Die. Deutsche Gold and Silber Schiedenstalt, the German gold and silver refining company, held controlling interest in Die. Die was a diversified company with stakes in industrial chemicals, precious metals, and a portfolio of subsidiaries spanning dozens of sectors of the German economy. But Die itself operated within an ecosystem dominated by an entity of an entirely different scale. IG, Farbahn, Interessengens, Steffs. Farbindustrie AG had been formed in 1925 through the merger of 6 of Germany's largest chemical companies: BASF, Bayer Hoechst, AGFA, Weiler Termeyer, and Griesheim Elektron. What resulted from that merger was, in terms of concentrated industrial power, something European capitalism had not previously produced in a single sector. The 4th largest company in the world by market capitalization, responsible for 85% of all German synthetic dye production with dominant stakes in pharmaceuticals, plastics, explosives, and synthetic fuels, with licensing agreements with Standard Oil of America, with Royal Dutch Shell, with Swiss and French conglomerates. With offices in New York, Paris, and London, IG Farben had Nobel Prize-winning researchers. It had a workforce of more than 200,000 people. It had a corporate intelligence division that historians describe as potentially more sophisticated than any state intelligence service of the period. It was, in every external sense, that industrial modernity had learned to use as proxies for legitimacy, a respectable global corporation. It was also the corporation that, through its stakes in Die and Die, stood at the center of the production and distribution chain of the product, arriving in canisters at Auschwitz. And there was a second company in this story that deserves specific attention, not for its scale, but for the precision of what it did. Top Ondesan of Erfurt in Thuringia was a mid-sized company founded in 1878, specializing in industrial furnaces for brewery malting, for food drying, for human cremation in cemeteries and hospitals. It was a niche company with a solid technical reputation. In 1939, it received a contract from the SS for the design, supply, and installation of cremation furnaces at a concentration camp in occupied Poland. The engineer assigned to the project was Kurt Pruffer. Pruffer visited Auschwitz multiple times. He maintained regular correspondence with the SS on technical specifications and processing capacity. That correspondence survived. It is digitized and accessible. In none of it is there any record of hesitation or questioning about the function for which the furnaces were being built. What Top Suend, San, and Die had in common was not ideology. It was calculation. The question each of them answered silently by processing the contracts, making the deliveries. Issuing the invoices was the same. Does the risk of refusing exceed the benefit of continuing? And both answered it the same way. Auschwitz was not built for what it became. That statement is not a mitigation. It is a historical fact that makes the camp's trajectory more disturbing, not less. Because it documents with precision how a system escalates violence when each ethical and institutional constraint is removed incrementally. One at a time, with administrative justifications at every step. The camp was established in May 1940, in the barracks of a former Polish artillery garrison in Oswiecim, a town incorporated into the Reich after the invasion of Poland. In September 1939, the initial purpose was to detain Polish political prisoners, resistance network members, intellectuals, clergy. The first commandant was Rudolf Haas, 39 years old, an SS veteran with prior experience at Dachau and Sachsenhausen. In his Nuremberg testimony and in the memoirs he wrote in prison before his execution in April 1947, Haas described his own mindset with an articulateness that historians still cite as one of the most clinically revealing documents on the psychology of the bureaucratic perpetrator. He did not process what he was doing as cruelty. He processed it as the management of operational problems. In August 19, Haas's deputy, Karl Fritzk, conducted the first test using Zyklon B on human beings. In the basement of Block 11, the punishment block of the main camp. The subjects were 600 Soviet prisoners of war and 250 sick prisoners from the camp hospital. Fritzk had observed the product being used for delousing barracks and formulated the hypothesis. With the cold logic of someone who had reached a point where any technical solution was invaluable, that it would work on humans with equivalent efficiency. It did. And the word Haas, used in his testimony to describe the reaction, was the same word that appears in virtually every SS operational document on the adoption of Zyklon B. Early tort relieved. The product produced results faster, with less direct psychological involvement from personnel. Without the logistical limitations of the carbon monoxide chambers that had been used in the Action T for Euthanasia program. The adoption was approved. But what needs to be understood about that moment, August 1941, the basement of Block 11, is that it was not a rupture. It was the logical continuation of a series of incremental decisions, each of which appeared reasonable within the context of the ones that preceded it. Industrial-scale violence does not begin with an order to kill 1 million people. It begins with the removal of one constraint at a time, each removal opening space for the next until the unthinkable becomes procedure. On January 20th, 1942, 15 men gathered in a villa on the shore of Lake Wannsee in Berlin. The meeting lasted approximately 90 minutes. There was lunch. There was cognac. And by the end, there was an administrative protocol that formalized, in deliberately indirect bureaucratic language, the decision to coordinate the systematic extermination of European Jews across the entire German sphere of control. Of the 15 participants, 8 held doctoral degrees. They were state secretaries, ministry directors, senior officials of the SS apparatus. The meeting was convened by Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Main Security Office, the man Hitler himself described as the Nazi with an iron heart. The protocol was drafted by Adolf Eichmann, who served as the meeting's secretary. The Wannsee Protocol is a document that historians have read and reread for decades, attempting to extract from it something resembling the moral deliberation that should precede a decision of that magnitude. They have not found it. What they have found is the same tone that characterizes any mid-level management meeting minutes: problem identification, review of previously attempted solutions, evaluation of the limitations of each approach, definition of the adopted solution, distribution of responsibilities, timeline. Hannah Arendt, who covered Adolf Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem in 1961 for The New Yorker, coined from this observation the concept that would become one of the most debated and most misunderstood of 20th century political thought: the banality of evil. Arendt was not arguing that what was decided at Wannsee was banal. She was arguing that the psychological mechanism by which extraordinarily destructive decisions are made and executed by ordinary people is structurally indistinguishable from the mechanism by which any other bureaucratic decision is made and executed. No hatred is required. No psychopathology is required. What is required is a structure that replaces the moral question with the technical question. Not should we do this, but how do we do this efficiently? The Wannsee Conference did not decide the extermination. Documentary evidence indicates that mass killings were already occurring since 1941 in occupied Poland and the Soviet Union. What Wannsee did was more dangerous. It institutionalized. It distributed responsibility across ministries in such a way that no individual held the entirety of the decision. It created a chain of command with sufficient usurciate bureaucratic detail for each, linked to process its function as administrative routine without needing to confront what the chain as a whole was producing. It was within this context that Auschwitz was redesigned. Between 1942 and 1943, 4 crematorium complexes were built at Birkenau. The extension of Auschwitz, situated 3 kilometers from the original camp, designed specifically to operate at the scale the Wannsee Conference had formalized as an objective. Crematoria 2, 3, 4, and V were integrated structures, underground undressing and gassing chambers at the lower level. Cremation furnaces at the upper level, connected by a vertical transport system. The design was developed by the SS Central Construction Department at Auschwitz, under the supervision of SS officer Karl Bischoff. What needs to be understood about these buildings, and what most narratives about Auschwitz fail to communicate with sufficient clarity, is the degree of engineering sophistication they represent. They were not improvised chambers. They were structures designed by technically trained engineers from detailed operational specifications, with careful attention to flow problems, ventilation, processing capacity, and integration with the camp's rail infrastructure. There were capacity studies. There were design revisions. There was technical correspondence between SS engineers, equipment suppliers, and contractors, covering every installation detail with the professional precision of any ordinary industrial engineering project. The furnaces came from TOPS-U, and Son engineer Kurt Pruffer had proposed a multi-chamber furnace model that maximized cremation efficiency. More chambers operating in parallel, using the residual heat of one chamber to initiate the cycle in the next, reducing fuel consumption per unit processed. Pruffer discussed these specifications in correspondence with the SS without any indication that the object of optimization was anything other than any other industrial engineering problem a furnace engineer might be contracted to solve. The gas chambers had false shower heads installed on the ceiling. This detail is frequently cited as evidence of calculated cruelty, and it was, in part, that. But there was also an operational reason. People in panic in a confined space are harder to manage than people who believe they are entering a communal shower. The architecture of the chamber was an instrument of behavioral management as much as an instrument of extermination. Both objectives were compatible, and both were considered in the design. Prisoners arriving in the transports went through a selection on the arrival platform. Most children, the elderly mothers with young children, and anyone demonstrating incapacity for labor were sent for immediate extermination. They were led to the crematoria basements, instructed to remember the number of the hook where they had hung their clothes for easy retrieval after the shower, and locked in from the outside. The Zyklon B canisters were opened at roof level by SS personnel. Without the warning additive, which Auschwitz had requested and received, removed, there was no alert odor. The gas descended silently. The time 3 kilometers from the crematoria of Birkenau while they were operating. Ekfarban was building a factory. The decision to build at Auschwitz was made in February 1941, following direct negotiations between the IG Farben board and Heinrich Himmler. The company needed a synthetic rubber production plant, technology it had developed in partnership with Standard Oil of America during the previous decade. Through agreements that Allied investigators would later identify as part of a corporate relationship that had remained active, even after the start of hostilities. The location was chosen for reasons that the company's internal memoranda recorded with the administrative objectivity that characterized all corporate documentation of that period. Adequate rail access, proximity to coal and water resources, and, in the precise language of a February 1941 memorandum signed by executives with identified names and titles, availability of concentration camp labor at below market cost. Below market cost. That is the language that appears in the documents. Not slavery. Not forced labor. Below market cost. The plant was designated internally as Buna work. Buna being the commercial name of the synthetic rubber it was meant to produce. And the labor camp built to supply the factory with workers became known as Auschwitz III or Monowitz. The agreement with the SS was direct. 4 Reichsmarks per day per unskilled adult worker, 6 per skilled worker. The SS was responsible for supplying, securing, and disciplining the labor force. IG Farben was responsible for production. Prisoners assigned to Monowitz worked in 10 to 12-hour shifts. The food ration was calculated to maintain short-term survival, not medium-term health. A distinction that camp's physicians documented with clinical precision. Because the physical deterioration of workers was itself a management problem. Workers losing productive capacity represented costs without return. Prisoners demonstrating incapacity were returned to Birkenau. Being returned to Birkenau, in that context, meant the chamber. The selection process at Monowitz therefore involved a second layer of screening. SS physicians periodically determining which prisoners were still productive enough to justify the continued cost of their subsistence at below market rates, and which should be returned to the extermination system. IG Farben did not operate that process directly, but the system that made the process necessary had been created by the contract the company had. Signed conservative estimates drawn from Nuremberg trial documentation indicate that at least 30,000 people died at Auschwitz-Monowitz between 1941 and 1945. The factory never produced synthetic rubber at commercial scale. IG Farben invested approximately 700 million Reichsmarks in the construction and never recovered that investment. What Monowitz produced in economically measurable terms was negative. What it produced in human terms is documented. This is where the history of Zyklon B makes its most disturbing move. The passage from atrocity to archive, from the unimaginable to the bureaucratic. And it is precisely for this reason that this move needs to be described with precision. The deliveries of Zyklon B2. Auschwitz between 1942 and 1944 were commercial transactions in the full technical sense of the term. There were formal purchase orders issued by the camp's administrative department. With requisition numbers and product specifications, there were comparative quotes between suppliers. The documentation indicates that on at least one occasion, the camp compared prices between 2 distributors before confirming the order. There were invoices with quantity, unit price, and total value. There were signed delivery receipts. There was inventory accounting. Much of this documentation survived because the SP, in the rush to evacuate Auschwitz in January 1945, under pressure from the advancing Red Army, which would reach the camp on January 27th, were unable to destroy all the files. What the Allies captured and presented at the Nuremberg trials included records sufficiently detailed to reconstruct the delivery schedule. The volumes, the prices paid, and the identity of the intermediaries at each step of the supply chain. Among the most cited documents in the trial proceedings is the order requesting the product version without the warning additive. There is no ambiguous interpretation of that order. The function of the warning additive had always been to alert people in the environment to the presence of a lethal gas. A concentration camp specifically requesting the removal of that warning is communicating, with precision, in technical language on a standard administrative form, that the people in the environment are not to be warned. The distributor that fulfilled the order was Tesch und Stabino of Hamburg, represented by Bruno Tesch. Tesch was tried by the British military tribunal in Hamburg in March 1946. The defense argued that he had no knowledge of the purpose of the products he distributed, that his operations were commercial and not political, and that responsibility for use rested with the buyers and not the suppliers. The prosecutors presented, among other evidence, the volume of Zyklon B supplied by Tesch to Auschwitz was incompatible with any conventional purpose of building disinfection or agricultural pest control. The volumes were industrial. The frequency was regular. The technical specifications of the product, without warning, additive, were inconsistent with use in environments where people might be inadvertently present and would need to be protected. Tesch was convicted. He was executed by hanging in May 1946. Gerhard Peters, the principal executive of Dagesh, was tried separately. Convicted at first instance, acquitted on appeal, retried in 1955, acquitted definitively. He died in March 1944. German forces occupied Hungary. Until that point, Hungary had resisted pressure from Berlin to deport its Jewish population. Regent Miklos Horthy had negotiated, delayed, and on several occasions directly refused. The occupation on March 19, 1944, ended that resistance. Adolf Eichmann, the man who had drafted the Wannsee Protocol 2 years earlier, installed himself personally in Budapest to oversee what came next. What came next was the fastest deportation operation in the history of the Holocaust. Between May 15 and July 9, 1944, 56 days, approximately 437,000 Hungarian Jews were transported to Auschwitz on 147 trains. Most arrived at Birkenau. Most were selected for immediate extermination on the platform. On peak days of that period, SS operational documents record that the Birkenau crematoria were being used beyond installed capacity. Pits were opened in the campgrounds for open-air burning of bodies that exceeded furnace capacity. An internal SS technical memorandum produced in June 1944 for a capacity assessment records the maximum daily capacity of the four Birkenau crematoria at 4,756 bodies. That number is not a historical estimate. It is an operational document produced by the system's own administrators, calculating whether the existing infrastructure was sufficient to process the anticipated arrival volume based on transport schedules. When that number is read in its original context, not as a record of horror, but as a capacity data point in an operational planning document, it reveals something about the nature of the system that no abstract description can communicate in the same way that the question being answered by whoever drafted that memorandum was not, is this permissible? But is this feasible? The moral question had been replaced by the technical question at some earlier point in the decision chain. And the memorandum was simply the natural continuation of that process. The total volume of Zyklon B used at Auschwitz between 1942 and 1945 was approximately 20 metric tons. Every delivery was documented. Every order had a requisition number. Every invoice had an identified recipient with name and title. The total number of people killed at Auschwitz is estimated at approximately 1.1 million. of whom roughly 960,000 were Jewish. The others included Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, Roma, and disabled individuals transferred from German institutions. In 1945, the Allies took control of IG Farben's facilities and archives. What they found at the Frankfurt headquarters, in the Berlin offices, in the Leverkusen laboratories, in the Hoechst archives, was one of the largest collections of corporate documentation ever produced on the systematic participation of a private company in a criminal state program, the IG Farben trial. Case VI of the Nuremberg subsequent proceedings, conducted by United States Military Tribunal No. 6, began in August 1947. 24 directors and executives were tried. General Telford Taylor, chief prosecutor of the subsequent proceedings, stated in his opening declaration something that still stands as one of the most precise diagnoses of the legal problem the case represented: that IG Farben had made decisions to participate in war crimes not through coercion, not through blind ideological loyalty, but through calculation of economic interest, that it had identified opportunities, assessed risks, and chosen to participate, that the corporation had functioned in relation to the criminal system of the Nazi state, in exactly the same way any corporation functions in relation to any market, identifying opportunities and acting on them. The results were inadequate to the scale of the crimes. In the assessment of nearly every observer who has written about the trial since, 13 of the 24 defendants were convicted. Sentences ranged from 1 year to 8 years. None received the death penalty. Otto Ambros, the director who had supervised the construction and operation of Monowitz, who had personally participated in negotiations with the SS on the supply of slave labor, who had visited the camp multiple times, received 8 years and was released in 1951 after 3 years of actual time served. The release of Ambros and other IG Farben executives was part of a series of sentence commutations approved by the United States High Commissioner for West Germany, John J. McCloy. Between 1950 and 1951, McCloy commuted or reduced the sentences of 79 of the 142 individuals convicted in the Nuremberg trials, including every IG Farben executive still serving at that point. The decision was made in a specific political context. The onset of the Cold War had transformed West Germany from occupied territory into a strategic ally, and the reintegration of the German industrial and administrative elite into the Western economy had become an American foreign policy objective that competed directly with the justice objectives that the Nuremberg trials had established. This is not speculation. It is the historical record, documented in American administrative correspondence recovered by researchers decades later. Following his release, Otto Ambros became a consultant to Dow Chemical and W.R. Grace. He died in 1990, at the age of 92, in Mannheim. Degesch was gradually absorbed by Degussa, which was incorporated into Degussa Hulls in 1998, which merged with SKW Trostberg to form Degussa AG in 2000, which was fully integrated into Evonik Industries in 2007. Evonik is today one of the world's largest specialty chemicals groups, with revenues exceeding 15 billion euros per year, headquartered in Essen, Germany. Topfun San went bankrupt in 1963. The company's technical archives, including the complete correspondence with the SS about the Auschwitz furnaces, were held by East German intelligence in a warehouse in Erfurt for decades after the war ended. They were rediscovered in 1990 following reunification. They are today preserved and accessible to researchers at the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial and at partner archives. IG Farben was dissolved in 1951 and divided into its constituent companies. BASF, Bayer, and Hoechst continued as independent companies and became, in the following decades, some of the largest pharmaceutical and chemical groups on the planet. Bayer AG publicly acknowledged in 1995, 50 years after the end of the war, its connection to the Auschwitz slave labor system and contributed to a compensation fund for survivors. In 2018, Bayer acquired Monsanto for $63 billion, becoming the world's largest producer of seeds and agrochemicals. Its current market capitalization exceeds 25 billion euros. None of these companies ceased to exist. None was dissolved, as a direct legal consequence of what had been done under its corporate structure. They were renamed, reorganized, partially held accountable decades later, and reabsorbed into the global market with new logos over old addresses, with new names over structures that in some cases trace back to the same corporate mergers of the 1920s that had produced IG Farben. This is not an indictment of the companies that exist today. It is an observation about how corporate systems survive events that the individuals within them do not, and about what that asymmetry of survival reveals about where responsibility actually resides when an institutional structure participates in a crime of historical scale. On May 11, 1960, Mossad agents captured Adolf Eichmann in San Fernando, on the outskirts of Buenos Aires, where he had been living with his family under the name Ricardo Clement. Eichmann had arrived in Argentina in 1950 with travel documents issued by the International Committee of the Red Cross, with the assistance of a support network for former SS members that included ecclesiastical and governmental contacts. He had worked for a decade as a factory worker at a Mercedes-Benz plant outside Buenos Aires. He was transported to Israel and tried in Jerusalem in 1961. The trial was the first major judicial proceeding in history to be televised. For a generation that had grown up after the war with fragmented information about the scale of what had happened in Europe, the images and testimony of the trial provided the first direct visual and auditory contact with the detailed mechanics of the system. Hannah Arendt, a German Jewish philosopher and refugee from Nazism who had published The Origins of Totalitarianism in 1951, covered the trial for The New Yorker and published her account in 1963. The thesis that emerged from that account, the banality of evil, generated one of the most enduring intellectual controversies of the 20th century, and is still cited, contested, and misunderstood with regular frequency in discussions about moral responsibility and institutional structures. What Arendt observed was not that Eichmann was innocent, or that what he had done was banal. It was that Eichmann was not the kind of monster the trial's narrative expected to find. He was a mediocre functionary, bureaucratically competent, ideologically superficial, deeply invested in his own career advancement, who had executed criminal orders with efficiency without ever confronting the moral significance of what he was doing. Not because he was incapable of moral reasoning, but because he had systematically substituted the procedural question for the moral one. Not, is this right? But does this fall within my functional parameters? The unsettling quality of Arendt's thesis was not in the absolution of Eichmann. It was in the implication that the necessary condition for participating in crimes of that scale is not an exceptional psychology. It is a completely ordinary psychology, operating within a structure that has removed the moral question from the decision-making process. Eichmann was sentenced to death and executed by hanging on May 31, 1962. He was the only civilian executed by Israeli justice in the history of the State of Israel. Let us go back to the beginning, to the invoice, to the purchase order without the warning additive, to the delivery receipt with a signature. At the start of this video, we posed a question about normalcy, about how a legitimate commercial product approved by health authorities listed in catalogs, sold to farmers and sailors, became the technical instrument of mass extermination. And the answer that the historical record provides is not satisfying in the way we would want it to be. It is not the answer of the monster. It is not the answer of the accident. It is the answer of the system. A system that replaced the moral question with a technical question at every decision point where the two could have diverged. A system where the furnace engineer asked about processing capacity and not about what would be processed. Where the chemist asked about the efficacy of the formulation and not about the purpose of the delivery. Where the executive asked about the economic viability of the contract and not about the conditions under which it would be executed. Where the mid-level clerk asked about the correct requisition procedure and not about what the requisition product would do to the people inside the enclosed space when it was opened. Each of those individuals made a decision. Each decision was rational within the parameters of the system in which they operated. And the sum of those rational decisions, each defensible in isolation, produced a result that none of them, considered alone, was required to directly confront. That is the structure Hannah Arendt was trying to describe. Not the psychology of cruelty, but the psychology of compartmentalization. The human capacity to divide responsibility into portions sufficiently small that each fraction can be processed as routine, without anyone needing to carry the weight of the whole. The companies that supplied the gas continued operating after the war. The companies that built the furnaces continued operating after the war. The executives who signed the contracts received sentences measured in years, not decades, and returned to the same industry they had never fully left. The corporations were renamed. The logos changed. The addresses, in some cases, did not. There are 30 kilometers of shelving in the Arolsen archives. There are names on index cards in case files in dossiers, covering more than 17 million victims of the system this video has documented. The archive was closed for 50 years. It was opened in 2007. Digitization is still ongoing. The names of the executives are in the documents. The names of the engineers are in the technical specifications. The names of the distributors are on the invoices. The record exists. The question that remains, the one that begins where history ends, is not about the past. It is about the present. Not how is this possible? That answer is relatively straightforward. It was possible because each component of the system did exactly what systems are designed to do, which is distribute responsibility until no single portion of it is large enough to be unbearable for the person carrying it. The real question is, what kind of structure needs to exist for the next person in the chain? The engineer, the chemist, the executive, the requisition clerk, to ask a different question. That answer exists in no archive. It only exists in the structures we are building right now, and in the questions we decide to ask before we sign.